Welcome to Living Your Greatness. Each episode, we bring on great people to inspire you to achieve your greatness. We discuss topics all related to health and wellness. Listen to world-class stories, learn valuable lessons, and turn knowledge into action. It is now time for you to unlock your inner greatness. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Living Your Greatness. This is your host, Ben Mummy, and today we have a new guest to the show, and his name is Dick Irvin Jr. For those of you who don't know Dick Irvin Jr., he is a retired Canadian sports broadcaster and author. Dick was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1988 under the Broadcasters category. In 2004, Dick was inducted into the Canadian Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Dick is also a graduate from McGill University, where he completed a Bachelor's of Commerce. While attending university from 1951 to 1953, he played hockey for McGill's varsity team, the Redmen, and worked part-time as an assistant to the equipment manager of Montreal Canadiens, the team his father coached at the time. So it is with great pleasure to welcome to the show today, Dick Irvin Jr. So Dick, let's get started with your background. Tell us more about your formative years growing up in Canada and what led you to a career as a sports broadcaster and author.
Well, I spent the first 19 years of my life in Western Canada in Regina, Saskatchewan. I went to public school there, high school, and then I went 2 years at the University of Saskatchewan and in Saskatoon. And my dad was coaching the Montreal Canadiens, and he would commute back and forth. He'd spend the summers in Regina, but the winters in Montreal, living at the Mount Royal Hotel. And he finally decided, after 11 years coaching the Canadiens, that we should move the family. So my mother and my sister and I were moved down. The summer of 1951, we moved to Montreal. And I was going to go back home to the West after I got through at McGill. I had changed to McGill, and I was just going to get my college degree and head back with my buddies in Western Canada. And here I am still in Montreal a lot of years later. I never left. I love this place. And so that's, and I started out working. I was 8 years working in industry after I got out of college, mainly for the Shell Oil Company. Great company, great job. But one thing led to another. It's too long a story but the new television station in town, CFCF, CTV, Channel 12, looking for an assistant sports director, and I got to know Brian McFarlane, who was the sports director, and he needed an assistant. He was all by himself running the department, and so I took a flyer on it and ended up working in the industry for over 40 years.
Thanks a lot, Dick, for sharing us about your formative years and how everything kind of evolved with your story and kind of your career. So Dick, as I mentioned in the introduction, you played for the McGill Redmen. You played for the varsity hockey team. You and your teammates were very fortunate to share the Montreal Forum with the Montreal Canadiens. Why is this experience one that you still cherish today?
Well, it was kind of strange. There was no McConnell Arena in those days. McGill had, for many years, long before I arrived, played their games and practices at the Forum. And I used to laugh. The Canadians used to practice 10 o'clock usually was the practice time for them, and a lot more practicing then than there is now because of the schedule. And they would practice, and they would sort of, I guess the last players would leave the ice around 11:15, 11:30 maybe, and then they would clean the ice, and out would come the McGill Redmen. And I used to think, Rocket Richard and Elmer Locke and Doug Harvey just left this ice, and now the Redmen come on. The first year I played here, we had a terrible team. We were last place. It doesn't seem to make sense. But anyway, that's the way it was. And we played all our home games at the Forum. Nobody came to see us, not even our parents usually. And the first year that I played here, the Carnival game was always the big game between McGill and the University of Montreal, who I can't believe they don't have a hockey team anymore. But anyway, the first year the Carnival was canceled because of the death of King George VI. who's the father of the current queen. But the second year we had the carnival game, and we had about, I'd say there would probably be about 5,000-6,000 people at the game, just because it was the carnival week. And we won the game 3-1, and I scored a goal. And the thing about that game was it was the first college hockey game ever televised in Canada. The French CBC did it, Radio Canada, and as I say, I scored a goal, and that was a first for Canadian college sports. That I think is probably the first college sports event. Television had just come in. I mean, that was 1953, 52, 53, my graduating year, and Hockey Night in Canada only started that same year. So it wasn't like there was a lot of hockey on television. It was only Saturday nights. One Saturday that people out west would get the game from Toronto. The next Saturday they'd get the game from Montreal. And that was it for a television standpoint.
Thanks a lot, Dick, there for sharing that story. Being able to play in the carnival game and as well as playing in the first ever college game out of all universities in Canada. And it's really cool that you, as well as all the other McGill Redmen, had the opportunity there during that time to get on and off the ice as the same players from the Montreal Canadiens. This brings me to my next question. Is it true that you were a Maple Leafs fan before becoming a Habs fan?
Well, I had to be. When I was born, my father was coaching the Toronto Maple Leafs. And he was in his first year as coach of the Maple Leafs, 1931-32, and they won the Stanley Cup that year. And that was the first time that the Toronto team won the Cup under the name Maple Leafs. There had been other Toronto teams that win it, but then Conn Smythe, the owner, changed the name to Maple Leafs maybe 3 or 4 years before that, and that was the first time they won the Stanley Cup. And my dad continued to coach Toronto for 9 years. So when he moved to Montreal, I was 8 years old and was in grade 3. So, I grew up in that part of my life naturally, cheering for the Maple Leafs. And funny, I bought a Toronto Maple Leaf hat one time at the Bell Center. I was wearing it one day at doing grocery shopping, and a man standing beside me at the meat counter started to give me heck, and he was serious about it. He said, "What are you wearing that Toronto Maple Leaf hat for?" And I guess he knew I was the Canadiens broadcaster at the time, and or just left it or whatever. And I said, listen, and I told him the story about my dad and coaching the Maple Leafs and winning the Stanley Cup with Toronto. I said, I've got some blue and white blood running in me, and I didn't apologize for it. So that's how I ended up. But then, after my dad coached his last game in Toronto in 1940, the final game of the Stanley Cup when the Rangers beat them, we were driving home. Oh, I cried. I was at the game, and they scored the winning goal in overtime. I cried. I was 8 years old, sitting with my mother. But then on the way home, my dad said, do you think he's going to cheer for the Montreal Canadiens? Of course not. What he meant was he'd always agreed to coach the Canadiens. And that was his last game in Toronto, and he knew it. And 3 days later, he was in Montreal signing his first contract to coach Montreal, and he coached the Canadiens for 15 years.
But you know what, Dick? There's nothing wrong with being a fan of a couple of sports teams. So, Dick, speaking of your father, what was he like as a coach? How did he motivate and develop his players?
Well, I was pretty young through most of his coaching career, and people used to ask me, what's it like living with a coach with your father as a coach in the National Hockey League? And I used to say to them, I don't know, because I never lived with him, basically, until his last 4 years here in Montreal. I was always living in Regina, and he was down in Montreal coaching the team. But I got a good insight into his work, of course, and then he ended up the final year of his coaching career before he passed away, coaching the Chicago Blackhawks. And that's the team he first coached when he broke into coaching before he went to Toronto. But the thing that I noticed about him as I look back on it, and a couple of other good coaches that I've spent some time with, namely Scotty Bowman, when the hockey season started, he was all hockey. That's all he thought about. That was his entire life. Now, he was a guy that had a lot of hobbies. When we were out west, he raised chickens, pigeons, breeded dogs, all that sort of thing. He was an amateur carpenter, but that was all basically in the summertime for him. When he'd come down east, I used to have to look after the pigeons and chickens when I was a kid in Regina. But he just was, it was his life. And without even questioning it, you know. And he had been a good player. He's in the Hockey Hall of Fame as a player, not as a coach, because he was an outstanding hockey player in Western Canada. And then he was the first captain of the Chicago Blackhawks when they formed that team in 1926. And so he was a star player in his day, and then he was a star coach. He is the only person in NHL history to coach in the NHL for 26 consecutive years. These guys today hope they last 26 consecutive weeks, a lot of them, but he lasted 26 consecutive years. So, and I know even Scotty didn't do it. Scotty broke all his records because he had all the records to begin with. Now, of course, with all. But when he was started coaching, the season lasted 44 games, and so you know it was not. You can't compare the records at all for the men who coached at that time compared to what now in relation to the amount of coaching that they do. So that's the thing that I remember, that he was, and the other thing too, Ben, is he got to know his players. He got to, players are individuals, you know, and he used to say, some players you have to handle with vinegar, and some you have to give a little sugar to. It depends on, Maurice Richard, the Rocket, played better when you made him mad. The coach got under his skin for some reason or other. Rocket played better. Boom Boom Jeffrion was just the opposite. You had to keep telling him how good he was. Then he played better. You know, if he got mad at Boom Boom, he got mad at you and he sulked. But so that's the things that the coach has to learn. And hopefully the good coaches today are doing the same thing.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that last point that you brought up there. It's so important for any coach to know how to put the person before the athlete, and knowing that there's not a one-size-fits-all formula, knowing that depending on their personality, there's a different approach of how they speak to them and how they communicate to them. And if a coach is successful at doing that, most of the time that you'll see the athlete builds that trust and kind of has a lot of respect, and for that reason feels comfortable, and then the athlete is able to perform their best. So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So Dick, moving to my next question, how did you get your start at broadcasting the game of hockey?
Well, I was working at CFCF, and CBC, of course, carried Hockey Night in Canada, and I had a boss named Bud Hayward, and instead of, like, you know, I was the other network, but he said to me one time, we've got to get you on that hockey telecast. So luckily, CTV picked up hockey back in the 60s on Wednesday night. CBC Saturday night was a tradition in this country. But the CTV network did Wednesday night hockey for a while. And Dan Kelly was the fellow who did the color for Danny Gallivan, the play-by-play man, on Saturday nights. But CBC would not let Kelly appear on CTV. Danny was okay. He did the games no matter what network it was on. But they wouldn't let Kelly appear, so they were looking for a color man for the games in Montreal. And guess who was the sports director of the local CTV station? And so guess who got the job? So that was how I started out doing color for Danny in the mid-'60s, was when the CTV picked up Wednesday night hockey. And then a couple of years later, Dan Kelly left the CBC and went to St. Louis, became the broadcaster for the St. Louis Blues. And so Saturday night didn't have a color commentator, and they let me do it. I don't know of anybody else in broadcasting history that had a regular job on both CBC and CTV for as long as I did. But that lasted from the mid-'60s until I retired from CTV in 1991. So I was, a good 20 years or more doing both networks. And it kind of rankled some of us, especially some CBC types, but there I was, and the CBC was good to me, and CTV let me do it, and I was very lucky. I don't know why I deserved to have that perk, really, but I did, and so I did all the games one way or the other, and the games that weren't on television. At the beginning, Ben, not many of them were on television, and in fact, some of the games weren't on at all in the mid-'60s, the Montreal Canadiens, and that's when they were Stanley Cup champions, and they had Jean Beliveau and players like that. And so I did CFCF Radio made a deal with the hockey team to do the games on radio. So I was doing a game, the Canadiens games, whether they were on radio or on television. I was doing them both.
Thanks, Dick, for sharing how broadcasting came into your life. It's definitely a really fascinating story.
Don't forget, too, I was doing the news as well. I used to do hockey broadcasts at the Forum, jump in a cab after the game, go back up to Park Extension, and go to CFCF and read the late news the same night I just finished broadcasting a Canadiens game at the Forum. So that was quite a time in my life, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I bet. So this leads to my next question. Who was your favorite broadcaster growing up?
Well, it would be Danny Gallivan, and doing the hockey. There were some broadcasters, sports broadcasters out west when I was a kid going to school. Names won't mean anything here. Lloyd Saunders, Johnny Esau, who ran CTV and did a lot of network stuff once CTV came into business. He had one of his starting places was Regina. No, I would think that and so I knew Danny personally through my dad, and that. So when I moved, people used to ask me, what was it like to move in and work beside Danny Gallivan? And I used to say there was no change at all. I knew the man, he knew me, we were friends, and it was just the glove fit. It was very easy for me to start working with him, and I worked with him for 17 years, and so that was the broadcasters in that day and age. Young broadcasters in Canada were given whatever to work 17 games with Danny Gallivan, and I ended up working with him for 17 years.
That's awesome. And what I find interesting, Dick, is not only was Danny Gallivan your favorite broadcaster, but you actually ended up working with Danny when broadcasting the Canadiens games on TV and on the radio. You mentioned that he was one of the best play-by-play commentators. What was it like working with him? Any good stories to share about Danny?
Well, there was lots of them. He was quite a character, and his command of the English language was something which I never mastered the way he did. That's for sure. And but here again, it's a fellow who was successful, who was just totally wrapped up in the work that he did. And his basic main job, for many years he did a radio interview show on CJD radio in Montreal. But he was known, of course, for coast to coast for his broadcasting. And he broadcast the Canadiens games, I think, for 32 years before he retired.
Absolutely. And you definitely feel when you go back and you listen to Danny and kind of how he spoke and how he described what was going on in those games, you definitely felt the energy. So not only was he good with describing with words, but also just the energy that he brought through his voice. So Dick, you must have many fond memories of broadcasting games with Hockey Night in Canada. What were some of your more memorable hockey moments for you?
Oh, golly. Well, the fact that I was in the broadcast booth for about 20 Stanley Cup winning games, for starters, I was, if you want to go to the other extreme, one of the biggest disappointments I had was that my father didn't live to see me in the business. I would have been a lot better hockey broadcaster if he'd have been around. I used to say some things on the air, and people would say, maybe said, boy, that guy knows a little bit about hockey. That wasn't me. I was just repeating something my father had told me 15 years ago about the game, because we talked hockey a lot. So I had that background going for me, too. But, I read somewhere the other day, and I find it hard to believe, but the 1971 Stanley Cup final between Montreal and Chicago, it was John Belival's last year. The game 7 was in Chicago, and that game still stands as the most watched hockey telecast in Canadian history. I don't get that. That can't be right. There must be more television sets and more, when Gretzky was around. But anyway, that's what they claim. It had a huge audience. I think it set all kinds of Canadian television records at the time. That year was quite memorable, I must say. And I think my best time then through it all were the years that Scotty Bowman coached the Canadiens, and the team won 4 straight Stanley Cups, starting in 1976 and ending in 1979. And that to me was the highlight time, because I did all the games. I was doing the games on the radio on the road that weren't on television. And the playoffs were a joke. They were so good. They were so much better than anybody else that one year they lost 11 games. And they had a bad slump in the playoffs. No, they lost 8 games, rather. And the next year they had a bad slump. They lost 11. Can you imagine? And in the playoffs each year, they lost maybe 1 or 2. That was it. It was. I used to do a radio show with Scotty before the games for the last 3 years that he coached the team. And I used to be glad if they lost the previous game because I'd have something different to ask them about. What do you ask a coach whose team has just won 15 straight games? There's not much. I couldn't figure it out anyway. But so it was. They were. I'll take that team. I know my great and good friend, the late Red Fisher. He leaned toward the Canadiens in the 50s when they won 5 straight Stanley Cups. It would be quite a game, I tell you. But I'll take that team in the late 70s and say that's the best team I ever saw play.
Thanks for speaking about that memorable moment, Dick. Definitely sounds like quite the game. So, Dick, moving to my next question. My father considers you to be one of the most celebrated hockey broadcasters of our time. In fact, you received special recognition to acknowledge your broadcasting career. What achievements were you most proud of during your career?
Well, I just, there's no one achievement I worked with. I mean, there's a lot of other people that get involved in producing a hockey telecast, be they announcers, technical people. I mean, the show doesn't get on the air unless somebody pulls the switch and the cameras go on. Nothing I can do about that when I'm a broadcaster. But it was just being able to lead that life for so many years. I did the Canadiens games one way or the other for 33 years. And, when I retired, it was time. I retired from radio after 29 years in 1997, and then I did my last game on television 2 years later in 1999. And I did it on my own terms, and I was the one who called up the bosses and said I'm retiring. And I must say Hockey Night in Canada was great to me. They kept me on the show for another 10 years, doing features and specials and Hockey Day in Canada and things like that. So, and even to this day, they had me on this year. I mean, I'm still a guy in his late 80s. I'm still part of the family, and they bring me into a lot of the stuff that goes on. And so, yeah, it was just the fact that I was there for so long. God, I went to a lot of different places. I was trying to figure out the other day, I'm close to 50 different arenas where I broadcast hockey games and places. One came here for them when they had the teams that were building a new arena, so they were playing the Tampa Bay Lightning, the best team in hockey right now. They played their home games for 2 years in the baseball stadium where the Tampa Bay Rays play. That's the worst place I ever did a game from. You were so far away from the ice you could hardly see the numbers. But anyway, it was just the life I was able to lead. I had a wonderful family at home. My wife, she raised 2 kids, and she did the raising, that's for sure. And I was able to travel to. I did the World Hockey Championships in Vienna, Austria, in 1967, and so. I had quite a run at it, and it was all just part of my life for so long.
That's truly beautiful. It's really nice to hear, Dick, how appreciative you are, from all the experiences that your career gave you through sports and broadcasting, but not only during your time, during your career, but even afterwards, by Hockey Canada, giving you these opportunities to continue to give back and be part of the community. And, that's so important, especially when there's a time in our lives where we put our career to an end, but it just shows that you could still find different ways to kind of give back and still be part of it. So, Dick, I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes to the game of hockey over the years. What do you think of the game today? Do you think it's better? Do you think it's worse?
I don't like the beards, but that's because I'm getting old. And I think, the difference is, when I started broadcasting in the NHL games, there were 6 teams in the NHL. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. When I finished broadcasting, there were 26. And then there's been 6 more added now. This coming year, there'll be 32, the most that there's ever been. That, to me, was a big change. We got a little bit of a taste of the old days this past year with the pandemic business when the Canadian teams only played the Canadian teams. As it turned out, I thought that it wasn't the greatest. It was kind of boring at the end when they were playing each other so often. Whereas in the old days, my God, it was the same. It was Montreal would play Detroit. There was a stretch in the 1950s through the last few years of my dad coaching here when Montreal and Detroit were far and away the two best teams. The other teams weren't even close. And when they played each other 14 times in the regular season, they played in the playoffs. Both series went 7 games. They played 21 times. But you look forward to it. Imagine Rocket Richard against Gordie Howe and, you know, Jacques Plante against Terry Sawchuk and all that. That was marvelous stuff to be part of. But I think that, you know, there was one year way back when, Pat Burns was coaching the Leafs at the time, the Montreal and Toronto played once, the opening game of the season at the Forum, and never played again all year. Montreal and Toronto. Now that's, what kind of a rivalry is that for Canadians, eh? That's the number one. And they only played one time. That to me, is the juggling that's gone on with the schedule based on the number of teams that there are now, that's made a big change for me. It's made a big change, especially since I've retired in my interest level, because there are just so many players. And it's very hard to keep track unless you want to make it you know, part of your life's work and learn them all, which is fine. Thousands of people do, and that's great. It keeps the game where it is. That to me is the big change. A lot more guys getting a chance to play. Hey, come on, 6 teams against 32, and then making a big living. That to me is the change that I have noticed most of all.
Thanks for bringing up those points, Dick. In your opinion, who were some of the most talented Montreal Canadiens players who ever laced up a pair of skates?
Well, you know, in questions like this, Ben, I hedge. I take the easy way out. It's like a lot of people have asked me, who's the best player you ever saw? I have never seen a best player. I've seen too many best players in my lifetime. I mean, you know, I saw my first NHL game in 1938 when I was 6 years old. And my mother and I came down from Regina to Toronto for the playoffs. I don't know why my dad did that, but and then we drove home in his new Buick car. I always answer that question this way. The most exciting player I ever saw was Rocket Richard. The most exciting player I ever broadcast was Guy Lafleur. But to me, the player who played hockey the best I've ever seen an individual play the game over a contracted period of time was Mario Lemieux. When I broadcast almost all of Pittsburgh's playoff games in the years 1991 and 92, when Mario won 2 straight Stanley Cups. I have never seen a player for the Canadiens or for any team play the games the way he played it at that time. So, you know, I've been very fortunate to see all these guys. Didn't see much of Wayne because he was in the West and we're in the East, and I certainly didn't see as much of him as I saw of Mario. But the two of them were just, even today, when I sit around and talk hockey or I get interviewed, those of us who were there at that time, it comes so easily to talk about Wayne and Mario. You know, it just, they were there, they were the two top guys, and they always will be in our mind, you know. And then you go back before them, and it's Lafleur, you know, and you know, then you got Howe and the Rocket, and people like the Belleville, of course, has to fit in there somewhere as well. Just had his, would have been his 90th birthday the other day. And yeah, I just, my God, all the great players that I saw it's just been amazing.
Absolutely. So, Dick, you've also known some of the best leaders in hockey. From your perspective, what makes a great leader?
Well, I think, you know, the best leader that the Canadiens ever had, I think, was Belleville. But at the same time, you had others as well. You know, other players that it's I don't know, it's the image, it's the approach to the game, it's almost like a good leader, if you're talking as a player leader, not as a coach leader, like a good coach, a good leader from a player standpoint also has to know the players. They have to understand what makes these guys tick. One guy ticks a little different than the other, and the guy who, not all teams have leaders. Not all teams some teams are pretty lousy, and there's not a leader in the group to straighten out the ship. But like, for example, Tampa Bay, I'm not familiar with them. They just won the Stanley Cup 2 years in a row. They must have a leader, but I don't know because I'm not that close to the teams, Whereas when I was doing the Pittsburgh games, you had Mario. When I was doing a lot of Philadelphia games in the playoffs, especially when the Broad Street Bullies were winning the Stanley Cup, it was Bobby Clark, obviously. There's guys who just can rise a little bit above the average. And you talk to the players today from the Canadian teams of the 60s, and they all talk about Big Jean. They don't talk about the coach. They talk about Big Jean. Big Jean said this. Big Jean said that. Big Jean said do it this way. I think he ran the team. I really do. And there's a lot of players that fit into that category. There's no question about it, There was a player just passed away, Rod Gilbert, played for the New York Rangers. He was, I think, probably definitely in that category, too. So they come along, Ted Lindsay in Detroit. Not Gordie Howe so much, so I'm told by the Detroit players, but Ted Lindsay. He was the guy that set the targets for them. He was the guy that was the leader of that team. And so the good teams have their good leaders, and there's no doubt about it.
Absolutely, Dick. You definitely mentioned a lot of great players there, and that really do make a difference to a winning team. It really is not always about talent, but more importantly, having a team of players that have the right chemistry. And you really do need a strong leader to lead those players. So, Dick, this brings me to my next question. What separates a good NHL player from a great NHL player?
Good question. It's like a great player in any sport. It's like a great leader individual in any profession. Heaven forbid we say politics, but I guess it's the same thing. They just somehow, kids grow up. I heard the other day that Mario Lemieux was when he started playing small kids hockey here in Montreal, his teams would win all their games 13-1, and Mario would score 12 goals. So they took his whole team and moved it up a notch, to play against older kids because they were too good. It was too one-sided. So right off the bat, here's a kid who's 10 or 11 or 12 years old, and he's far and away better than anybody else. I don't know. I can't really answer that question. You could tell when you saw players, and a lot of players who didn't win many Stanley Cups. I think of Marcel Dion. I think of Brad Park. Players like that. They were when you saw them play. There's a skill level involved here too. You can be a guy that's got a good leadership qualities and that, but if you can't play hockey to the standard of the National Hockey League, you're not going to last very long. And sure, a team might miss you when you're not there, but let's face it, they have to win games. And so a lot of these guys that could be good leaders probably weren't good enough hockey players to last. So you've got to have a combination of that. But it's so funny that you asked that question, and I think back to watching the games all the way back into the 50s, and the good players would just, I don't know, they just sort of stand out. I suppose it's the same. And I remember watching Willie Mays a few times when he would come to Jerry Park to play the Expos with the San Francisco Giants. You knew that he was better than everybody else. Just the way he did things, the way he hit, the way he ran, the way he caught the ball, that's like the good players of their day. Jean Beliveau is that's one guy. Beliveau is the one player who, to me, drew the most respect from the fans all around the league. Every time he showed up with the Canadiens, Beliveau was. You could tell that the fans knew he was something special. But along with it. Along with the fact that he was the big number 4, he could play the game. He was Glenn Hall, the goaltender, who played 502 consecutive games without a mask. There's one for you to think about for a record that will never be broken. He told me one time, he said he thinks Beliveau is not rated as highly as he should be in the overall scheme of great players in hockey history. And I believe him, too. But, it's just that they have the ability. Bobby Hull, Stan Mikita. These guys, it's Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita were stars when they were playing bantam hockey. And they just kept it up. And Mario Lemieux and Guy Lafleur, big star in the Quebec Pee Wee hockey tournament, he ends up being the best player in the world for 3 or 4 years. It's there. They have it or they don't.
Those truly are some great points that you brought up there, Dick. So, Dick, moving to my next question. My brother Eric enjoys watching Hockey Day in Canada each year. What has been your favorite piece that you have contributed to the show?
Oh, well, I was the one thing I'm kind of proud of is I'm the only person I think. Now, I could stand corrected on this. I think I'm the only person in the history of Hockey Night in Canada who has been the host, the color man, and the play-by-play man. Has done all 3 jobs. Nobody else has done that, I don't think. That's kind of a nice thing to think about, Not that anybody besides me realizes that, including the people that work at Hockey Night, probably. But so that's one thing, and I just hope that along the way, in all the years that I was doing the job, that I was able to bring some entertainment and some knowledge to the viewing public. They're the important people, not the players. The important people, in my mind, it was always the people watching. They've taken time out of their life to watch a hockey game. I just happened to be a guy that was in the announcer's booth, and I hope that I was able to, in some small way, give them some entertainment, give them some knowledge of the game that I was able to pick up, and God knows it could have been a lot better. Like I say, I wish my dad had been around longer. But that's what I have taken away from my time with Hockey Night in Canada.
Okay, great. So, Dick, as you know, the purpose of this podcast is to inspire people to achieve greatness and enhance their personal well-being. What is your definition of greatness?
Well, it's people are just a bit better at what they do. One of the most stirring moments of my life was when I was on a couple of senior tours to England. And I went with a group of people, and we visited England more than once, went to shows and so on. But on 2 occasions, Ben, we visited the grave of Winston Churchill. And let me tell you, you talk about shivers up your spine. I didn't. The first time was a surprise for us. It wasn't on our itinerary. But the bus driver stops. He said, "We have a bit of a surprise for you today, folks. And this is a little cemetery, and there was a little church, and there was 10 o'clock in the morning at this little English country town, and there was nobody around. And he took us out, and here's the Churchill family plot. And there is Winston Spencer Churchill's grave. Well, he was still is one of my big heroes of my life. And, and he never stopped. The good ones never stopped. He was a leader right to the end. He continued to do, rightly or wrongly, he continued to do what he wanted to do. And, that's sort of, if I can transfer that to memories of hockey, I can think of memories of Jean Beliveau, memories of the Rocket. Amazing people. They were just, they loved what they did. That's the main thing. I think maybe a little more than some of the others do. That's one thing that I think is good. You have to have skill. You have to, God, some of Churchill's sayings over the years hit home to people even today, even to an 89-year-old guy like me today. Same thing he said them in the 1940s. It's amazing.
That is amazing. And something that I actually want to take a moment here with our audience to kind of point out is something that you just said. You are 89 years old, and just hearing you speak, hearing your wisdom, and witnessing how sharp your memory is. In fact, it truly, really is as sharp as a pencil. What would you recommend to someone your age? How do you keep so well?
Get lucky. I'm not necessarily healthy, Ben. I've had my aches and pains and still have them, and they're getting worse as I get older. I was at dinner with some people basically my age or almost recently at the golf club I belong to, and we all were lamenting about, Jesus, why do we have to get old? Comparing, the conversation's always about who had the latest knee operation and who had their shoulders separated and all this stuff. It's kind of funny, really, when you think of it. But I've been very lucky, and I've had my share of the odd visit to the Lakeshore General Hospital, where the treatment has been absolutely marvelous. nothing serious. And so here I am, doing the best I can.
Well, you definitely inspire me. I hope I live till at least 89 years old, and I hope my memory is just as sharp as yours, as well as I'm able to speak and communicate my thoughts, feelings, and emotions just as well as you. It truly is inspiring. In fact, I don't think it's luck. I believe it's a lot more. I know you're someone who is a big reader, you're a big writer, you're constantly continuing to learn. So I think there's been a lot of work that you've put in over the years that has kept you to be at this level of wellness.
You just mentioned something there that I forgot to mention myself. In my life, as I look back, one of the things that I'm kind of proudest of is that I wrote 6 books. And I wanted to write one, and I finally wrote one book, and I said, there, I've written a book, and I ended up writing 5 more, and all on hockey, and they all did well, they all sold very well, and it was very satisfying. Not the sales don't matter, but it was the satisfaction of doing it. And I met a lot of hockey people doing those books, Ben. I did them, a lot of it was their words, not mine, doing interviews. And that's the way I got to know a few more people. The referees, I did a whole book on referees. Boy, these guys are great. You talk about wanting to be involved in hockey. You really got to want to be involved to be a referee and take the abuse that these guys do. But that's another part of my life that I look back on with a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah, absolutely, Dick. Writing your own book, or as you said, writing 6 books is a huge accomplishment. There's a lot of individuals that don't realize the amount of effort goes into writing a book, right? The whole process and putting words onto paper and reevaluating and constantly seeing where your book goes. So that's huge. That's awesome. So Dick, who is a future guest that you would like to see on this show?
Oh, on this show? Well, that's a good question. I go back to my favorite hockey team, the Flower, and Steve Shutt would be a very good guest for you. He lives in Florida. I don't know where, but he's there. And Larry Robinson. That's one thing that those guys. I mentioned Steve and Larry. It's funny. You talk to them today, they can remember goals and that were scored back in the 70s like it happened yesterday. Not all players were like that. My dad used to say that Rocket Richard didn't know how he scored a goal after he scored it. He couldn't tell you how he scored it. Guy Lafleur was the same. They did it all on instinct. They did it. They were just naturals. I remember Larry telling me one time how the Canadiens, Scotty wasn't happy with the power play, so he decided to make out a system, and he finally gave up practicing it after 2 days because Lafleur couldn't do it. He couldn't do a planned play. Everything with him just had to be instinctive. The same with Rocket. Rocket was exactly the same. And you got to know your players. Ken Dryden would be quite a guest for you, that's for sure. There's no doubt about that. And I think a fellow that I think would give you a pretty good interview is Anthony Calvillo, who was the Alouettes quarterback for so many years. I believe he's still in Montreal, and he was a wonderful football player. The team hasn't been the same here since he retired, that's for sure. So just off the top of my head, there's some thoughts that I have.
Thanks for that list of names there, Dick. I will do my best to try and bring some of those names onto the show to not only talk about their life and kind of what they've done and where they've achieved greatness, but also analyzing their overall wellness as a person. So Dick, I really wanted to take the time to really thank you for being here today. Thank you for all the wisdom that you've shared and all the stories that you have told. I'm sure my listeners are really appreciative of your time. So again, thanks again for being here today.
Well, I'm very flattered, Ben, that you're picking an old guy like me, and you'll make it 89. Don't worry. You'll still be doing this show when you're 89.
Thank you for listening to the Living Your Greatness podcast. If this show has added value, please subscribe, leave a rating, and make a review.